Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Thinking Project podcast, where we interview founders and creatives to help you take the next step in your business by listening to inspired stories of these wonderful founders. I hope you enjoy this podcast and make sure to share it with your friends. Thank you so much for tuning in. What's up, Connor? How are you, my friend?
Dalton, thanks so much for having me on the show. Really excited to see what we jump into today.
Dude, I'm excited to be here. Real quick, you have a lot going on. But one of the things you have is your Millenial in the Middle podcast, right?
Yes, sir.
And then you have the Opt Me business, right?
Yep.
Or Opt.
Yep.
Tell us more. Tell us more about what you got going on. Introduce yourself.
Yeah, kind of like a lot of people, I think your path a lot of times takes some weird turns. It is a little windy, but getting to the point where you are, and it's pretty cool to see how a lot of events have come together over the last little bit. And I think for a while I knew I was preparing for something, but didn't quite know what I was preparing for. And right now I can say, yeah, here's what's going on. So to give you a little background, I started my career as a professional speaker. Ever since I was a little kid, that's what I wanted to do. Stage fright is not a thing I've ever felt. The bigger the crowd, the better. And I had that entertainer side in me, and started my career working for a financial investment training company in the seminar world. And at 21 years old, like, I'm speaking on stages. I was traveled to 47 states, 10 different countries, and was on the road about 3 or 4 weeks a month. So it was, pretty crazy lifestyle for about 5 years. And, honestly, from the speaker standpoint, it was kind of like that, getting your 10,000 hours, right? Of getting in there, and a lot of reps. I was on stage for about 3 hours a day, day after day after day, with new groups. And so I really enjoyed that. And I saw all of a sudden, like, kind of the entertainment side and this speaking side that I've always seen. It all of a sudden merged with sales and business and marketing. And that's what really got me excited. I joined a startup company pretty early on, about 5 years ago, that ultimately got me off the road during that bit. I worked with a company called Gig, Gigg, and was there for about 4 years doing all things sales and marketing, and kind of learned the tech startup game for the first time. And then at the end of last year, I connected with a gentleman named Jason Peterson, who has done a lot of different startups as well as buying bankrupt businesses. And that's kind of been his MO in his career. And we started riffing on this basic idea of a monetized meeting and getting paid for your time. And it's led to what we're about to launch, the app called Opt. Our website is optme.com. So the company's Opt. It's like Venmo me, right? We're trying to make that the verb going that way. So definitely can tell you more about that. And then along the way, I've kept my personal speaking side going with a podcast. It looks like you and I both were bored in 2020. I saw you started in May of 2020. I think I started in like June of 2020, and kind of used that time, that year where everything kind of changed, to pivot, figure out new things, and about 85 episodes in, and all sorts of things there.
That's sweet, man. No, your podcast is great. And I love the title of it, right? The Millennial in the Middle thing. Isn't I have a lot to kind of go into with your story. I love that. But isn't it funny how Millennial is kind of like that middle generation now? Like, we got stuck kind of in between, right? I'm a Millennial as well.
For sure. I mean, I've always loved generational theory and looking at, because really it's history, and the point that we are in our lives when we face big events, and we do that as a society, we do that as a globe together. And I love studying how we react and how that affects the way we communicate, our culture, our careers, for sure. And so, to me, I think millennials are now kind of that middle generation between kind of the group that's phasing out and Gen Z that's coming up, and trying to find that common ground.
Yeah, because we were, right? Like, most millennials grew up in a time, like, I remember times before the iPhone, right? And
For
before
sure.
Facebook and all that stuff. And then, so you have like the generation before us who never grew up with that, didn't have it until they were much older. And then you have the new generation who doesn't know anything different. Like my daughter, like we, like, first world country problems, but like my Netflix was down. So I let her watch, like, we had some kind of TV show on, right? It was like we were at a hotel, right? And we didn't have Netflix. We just turned on the TV. And she was like, Dad, the TV's broken. And I go, what are you talking about? And she goes, it stopped playing my movie. Here, look. And it was a commercial. And she'd never seen it. I mean, my daughter's 5, but like, it's just funny how like she's never seen a commercial. She thought it was broken. It's so wild.
And especially technology, right? Like it so affects the way we were raised and brought up. One of the terms they often call Gen Z is iGen, and it's your daughter, right? Like grew up with an iPad and an iPhone in hand, and we're starting to see how that generation's going to take the workforce and what they'll do, but just trying to make some sense of it all, right?
Yeah, that's wild. So you're 21, you're speaking. I'm interested. This is a lot of things that like people, ask a lot, right? Everybody, that's like for some people, I guess that's the ideal gig, right? Like I get paid to speak and that's all I do. So, and I mean, there's obviously more to that, but I'm curious, how did you land in the professional speaking world to begin with?
Yeah, really good question. As I was young, it was something that I was good at. I had a skill and I really loved it. So of course I wanted to go make it happen. But, when you're young, you don't necessarily have anything to speak on yet, right? Like it's kind of that mode of, you can't go be a motivational speaker or a business consultant when you haven't done anything in the real world. You got to have some gray hair.
Sure, yeah.
And so specific to the speaking, what I found was there were either two ways to break into that industry. You, one, had to do something or have some story that other people wanted to hear, or you start speaking for an established organization or established company. And so that's what I did. And I was teaching their concepts and their principles and, their investment strategies and things like that. And then I think at some point, every speaker or every creator that's done that for an organization or a corporation, they realize that they want to start talking about their own stuff, right? Like all of that time for 5 years on the road, while it was my personality and I was making real connections, I was pitching someone else's concepts and ideas and their business. And I always knew there would be a time that would shift, and it would then be time for, me to share what I was passionate about. So maybe you could say I did it backwards. I got the speaking experience first, then figured out what I wanted to speak on. And now here I am.
Well, but sometimes that's how you have to do it, though. That I love that you said that, like speaking for an established company, because like that's also how a lot of speakers start their own speaking journey, is they like create a company where they have other speakers come, right? They create a business and they bring in other speakers. Kind of like, like I one time I was just messing around on LinkedIn, and I was like, my dream is to moderate an event at one of these big events like Consumer Summit or something like that. I want to moderate a panel. Yeah. And somebody wrote in the comments, they're like, just start an event and moderate your own panel. I was like, well, thanks for making it sound so easy, making me feel stupid, man.
It's totally true. Like you just got to jump in, you got to get started, and the credibility comes along the way. And you never feel like you're there. Like I was just talking to a friend the other day about imposter syndrome, and he was starting a new business and was kind of basically feeling that sentiment. And I said, look, if you're not feeling a bit of the imposter syndrome, you're not thinking big enough. Right. And so I think having that of like, wow, just jump in shows to me that you're on the right path and you're doing things.
Yeah. And that's that's the hardest part for businesses. Right. And that's my like message to everybody, because I'll inevitably talk with like somebody who listens to the podcast or some of my friends, and we'll be talking about business, and they're like, how do I do this thing? And I'm like, bro, you just got to start, right? Yeah. Like you just have to get going and work on it. Right. I think that's cool. So let's dive into, I think that's funny, right? Because you go from public speaking. I mean, it's interesting, right? It's like you go from public speaking, then you go into this arena where, you're helping other people. So you're getting paid to speak, and now you're helping other people to kind of get paid to speak, essentially, right? Like for their time and all these things.
Yeah.
Where did that idea come from?
Yeah, really, really good question. And this is kind of where it all comes together. Frankly, Opt is a pandemic born company. That I think the pandemic, we all knew when it was happening that it was going to change the world, right? Like that this just little brief pause in our day-to-day routine would lead to huge changes moving forward, but we didn't necessarily know what that would be, right? Like in the middle of it, we knew this was big, but we didn't know how we'd come out on the other end. Yeah. And for me, I think more than anything else, like there was an awakening that took place. And going back to generational theory, actually, like they list the types of events in our nation's history that lead to this, some sort of reaction or some sort of, following events that take place because of one big thing, and really an awakening in the sense of people were able to stop for just a second, get off the hamster wheel. We were bored for the first time ever. These are the days that we're sitting home watching Tiger King. And it was such a weird time. But what happens when the whole world goes through this little pause at the same time, and we reevaluate our priorities and our values and what matters most? What do we want our life to look like? And as far as our careers go, there are three things that happened that really were pretty sequential. The first is work from anywhere. Right? Like all of a sudden our eyes were open to the fact that exactly what we're doing right now, like this is possible. And I didn't have to drive up to your place. Like both of us can take an hour of our day and do this. Yeah. And I think it made people way more accessible, and it made opportunities way bigger. Like your potential market as an individual that you could reach suddenly just blew up when you could work from anywhere. Yeah. And so then the next kind of trend with that is all of a sudden people want now to go back to work, right? Like, all right, corporations are saying, come back into the office. And what happens? 40 million people resign. Yeah. Right? Like the great resignation takes place where you have people, because they didn't have to go to the office or the 9 to 5 and they took a break. They said, I hate that, like I don't want to do that. That's not what I'm passionate about. And that then leads to the third of a lot of what's being written about right now is what they call the passion economy. Yeah. And it's this mindset, right, of people finding what they're good at and what they love, which typically align because as humans, we like being good at things, right? Yeah. And figuring out how to monetize on that, how to make money, how to turn that into something official. And so that's kind of the movement that was taking place. And, we can step more into then how Opt plays that, but that kind of sets the scene for how this idea kind of came to be.
Yeah, that's interesting. Passion economy, right? Because passion, I feel, is like a buzzword. So I've interviewed a lot of people, like even like I interviewed one time, her name was Gabrielle Boucher. She's like a passion coach, like teach people how to like turn their passion into money. Right. But what's funny is it's like a buzzword because you hear like the both sides, right? Like find your passion. And then you hear some, like you hear like at both sides of the hustle culture, right? It's like, you have this, like, find your passion, do your passion. And then you have the other side that's like, F that, right? Just like do what you, do what you have to do to succeed kind of thing, right? Whether that's passionate or not. And so you kind of have this like both sides of the aisle where I feel like we're not getting like a real clear message. Like sometimes it's very woo woo, and then sometimes it's very like, forget about it, right? So where do you kind of see yourself on that spectrum as far as like, how do you teach people about their passions, or like how do you help people come into their passions or something like that?
Yeah. I would say the old school way of thinking is kind of this line around like, oh, forget about money, just chase your dreams, right? And I think there's a big portion of society right now that's saying, no, I don't think the two are mutually exclusive. Like, I think you can want to chase money and want to be successful and effective and do what you love. And so I think it's definitely ideological at its core. And I definitely fall on that ideological side of like pro-passion economy. Yeah. But then when the rubber meets the road, it's more than about, okay, how do you monetize on that? And to me, as we built Ops, so we'll get into the app, but really simply, it's a way to pay people for their time or get paid for yours, right? Yeah. And so we use this example, like, as we were going through the whole like user flow, there's all sorts of people that this could fit and all these diverse ways of going about it. And we use this example of like, if someone was an expert in lizards, right? Like, as dorky as that might sound, but like they know everything about lizards. If you're going to buy a pet lizard, like this is the guy to talk to. And 20 years ago, that person, if they wanted to chase their like quote unquote lizard dreams, right? They would probably get a job at Petco, and they would be the person there to work at it. And only people that were close enough to that location of the Petco could show up and benefit from his expertise. Whereas now today, with social media, with the power of content and the reach it can have, and then virtual meetings like we're all accustomed to now, all of a sudden, if you were the world's leading expert in how to have a pet lizard, you've gone from your town that you can influence to literally the world, right? Right. And so that is where kind of the rubber meets the road. And of course, there's a lot of steps in actually making it happen that might be dependent on the job. But I think it can happen. I think it's realistic.
Okay. I agree with you. It's just, but do you see what I mean? Like, it happens all the time. You kind of just see both. But I feel like I'm in the same vein with you, which is like, you can be passionate about something and then also have the reality of like, this is my passion, but that doesn't mean it's going to be rainbows and butterflies when we start trying to do this thing and nail it, right? Sure. Because certainly you're going to have bumps in the road, and then that's where passion comes in, right? So I'm assuming that's kind of where you end up with that, is like, if you're passionate enough, it'll help you cruise through those hard times.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And also the realization that we don't need to be defined by just one thing, right? Ooh, like, what do you do? Oh, I am an attorney, or I am a plumber, right? Like, you might be a plumber that also is a lizard expert. Who knows, right?
Yeah, right.
But I think kind of opening up to these ideas of, we have more ways to trade our time for dollars now than just going and getting a job. Yeah. I know that makes a ton of sense. And so, do you ever work with people to help them kind of identify what they're passionate about, or are there signs with things that you like to do that kind of emulate or kind of point to what someone is passionate about? Yeah. So for the time I was on the road, I spent 5 years out speaking. We had, I probably saw a couple hundred fresh faces a day that were looking for financial freedom, looking for a better way, or trying to make it right. And so I saw them day after day after day. And I think there's a realization that the status quo isn't working for a lot of people, right? And the plan that we were all given, that you do this and you rise the ladder, like, one, a lot of people didn't want, and two, they did want it, but it wasn't working out. Right. And so, I didn't have during that point a whole lot of answers for those people, to be honest. It was like, well, here's the playbook, here's how things roll. And so work harder, or maybe you'll get a lucky break along the way. And I think it was so many of those conversations that then paved the way to Opt, because, we looked at it and we said, we could build something that's very specific to an industry, or, like, all right, real estate agents are always trying to get people's time, so let's build a real estate tool. And we really, from a lot of those conversations and knowing how diverse people's backgrounds, expertise, skills are, we said, we need to build this so it's Venmo simple, so everyone can use it. And it's not like you have to go through some big application process to get accepted. Like, if you have people that value your time, or you value the time of others, can you make those, those meetings or those sessions, whatever it might be, happen in a realistic way?
Yeah, I like that a lot. When you so here's the thing with I have two questions. And they're a little different, but the first one is kind of on this passion idea. How do you turn your passion into money? Like, what does that look like? Are there steps? Is it more, philosophical than that? Or I mean, what does it look like?
Yeah. One thing that we've talked quite a bit is this problem that a lot of people have is that we call it know, but not known. And what we mean by that is these people know things. They have an expertise, they have the experience, they have the passion or whatever it might be, but they as an individual are not known, right?
Yeah.
Like they don't have a following or any sort of credibility or, like a stamp certification to basically say, hey, here I am. And so I think if you find yourself in the position where you're in the know but not known, then the first trick becomes getting known, putting yourself out there. And especially with social media, we have the ability to get a message out in a way that we never had before. But here's how I would make that a little cautionary. I think when we think of like putting out content, especially on social, that the metric for success is thousands and thousands of followers or going viral and becoming this influencer. And I don't think that's the case. I've seen a lot of people be really successful with their passion with 5 to 10 awesome clients or 5 to 10 people to repeat. So you don't have to be the influencer, right? But you've got to put yourself in a situation to where you can get solid recurring business and revenue.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, you pointed out two ideas there that really resonate with me, that I talk about all the time on this podcast, which is that number one, like, success looks different for everybody, and that's okay. That like we all don't, like, statistically, it's impossible for all of us to be Elon Musk, right? But can we find happiness doing what we love and working with people that we want to work with and make money and live the life we want to live? And obviously I think we both agree the answer to that question is yes. Right.
Sure.
And then just like getting out there and not focusing on the outputs, focusing on the inputs. So social media content is a great example of this, right? Like it very much is like with a podcast, like, mine is like right here and then it goes up, 2 years, 200 episodes. And then finally I get it right. Like, and that's pretty quick, comparatively, but like, just be patient and keep working, and like all those things are great advice.
Yeah. And kudos to you. We have similar stories in the podcasting world, right? Of like my first episode was in my living room with, just like this janky little setup I'd put together. And I go back and listen to those first 15 episodes. Now I'm like, oh, this is awful. I feel bad for making people listen to this. But you just have to get rolling. It's never going to be perfect, but hopefully it only gets better.
Yeah, absolutely. So my idea with that, like my philosophy is done is better than perfect, right? So like just, and people love to see the progression of you as a creator, of you as a brand and a business and things like that. So I don't think there's anything wrong on that end. You know what I mean? As far as like just making sure that like you're doing what you love and kind of getting to that point. And so, and that kind of brings up, this other point of like how, opt helps people, right? So like the thing when I hear opt, and I've kind of seen your stuff on LinkedIn and everything like that, and so for me it's like, okay, that's cool, right? But like someone like me, right, like I guess I have a little imposter syndrome, but like, I'm a sales coach, podcasting, but like I don't know who would ever randomly pay me money to meet with me. You know what I mean? Does this tap into your no not known kind of idea?
Well, I think there will be different categories of users, right? There's categories of users that are already charging for their time and they're just looking for an easier way to do it or to systemize it, right?
Yeah.
Then you have another group of people that aren't necessarily charging for their time, but they could. It's the ones that
sure.
always
Yeah.
are getting hit up of like, hey, can I pick your brain or can I take you to lunch? And
Yep.
the phrase that we hear over and over is these people would be willing to pay them, but if there isn't a process, it's a really awkward conversation, right? To then be like, well, I'd love to sit and talk to you about your startup, but can you send me $80? You know, like that. People don't feel comfortable doing that. And so we basically said, if we can go in there and the response to that is, oh yeah, well, here's how I handle this. I charge $100 an hour. It's communicated by the app. The schedule is there in a very similar way to a Calendly or something like that, where they could go pick it out. All of a sudden, there's this little sense of credibility in the fact of, this happens to me all the time, and this is how I respond. And then you give the other person the ability to opt in or opt out, right? Like they make the choice of how they want to spend their time. And then there's that third group that maybe is where you fit, that you'd like to be to the point where you could charge for your time. Maybe it's a sporadic thing, but I would also say that you could possibly see yourself on the other side of the spectrum of paying for others' time of, you know, you've got a podcast. Hey, I'll pay you $100 to come on my podcast. And how different does that conversation look when it's like, this is what I do all the time. And maybe you get some interviews with people that, you know, I know you pride yourself on talking to little guys, but maybe that's a way to get to the big guys.
Maybe it is, you know, because that's true though. I mean, I've had some instances where it's like, they would love to do a podcast, but they're just, I mean, at this point, you know, any extra time, you know, they got to be making money. And I don't ever think that's a bad thing. Like, cause I've been on the other end of that conversation where like, look, would love to, you're awesome, blah, 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 blah. But you know what I mean? And it's fine. Like, I get it. You know, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I would imagine though, that there's been some pushback, some resistance to this kind of model. Am I off base there, or like,
you know, it's basically, I think a lot of people know that they have to value their time. Like we all say that phrase, like, oh, I value my time. It's my most valuable asset. But we really struggle putting a value on it. Right. And so I think that it's definitely a paradigm shift for a lot of people that haven't done that before. And, you know, think about it. We have an app to sell or rent anything, right?
That's true. It's wild.
But yet our most valuable asset, like it seems like we struggle more than anything else with that, of putting a price tag on it. And that's why currency was designed in the first place, to value something. And so I think as the passion economy becomes more prevalent, and as Zoom meetings and these independent people out there doing things, I think currency as a form for time is going to become so common, and not even that we don't even bat an eye at it.
Yeah, no, that's, and I totally agree. It's just, you know, that's like the devil's advocate in me, right? That's just like, you know, because like, you know, you're on both sides where it's like, you know, why would I pay for someone's time? Why would someone pay me? But I think, you know, that's, you know, as I run through that in my mind, it's kind of like a scarcity mindset. Like, you know, instead of like having that abundance mindset of like, if I want to meet with this person, I can pay to do that. Like this would have been great. But you know what though? Two thoughts to this. This would have been great starting my podcast, but it also my podcast then might not have ever happened, because my podcast started because I asked a bunch of people, you know, like lunch for an hour, blah, 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 blah. Right. And they were all like, no. And I was like, okay. So then I hear this, Gary Vaynerchuk, I'm sure you're familiar.
Yeah.
He talked about networking and creating a place where people wanted to be. So I was like, oh, well, everybody likes to talk and I like to talk and podcast, you know, whatever. So funny enough, I went back to all those 10 people and I was like, hey, I know we couldn't go to lunch, but I just started a podcast. Would love to interview you on my podcast. All 10 of them. Yep. Anytime you want.
Yeah.
I was like, but that was there was a, you know, it wasn't necessarily money, but there was value for them because they could get their story out. They knew it was free marketing for them.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And that, to me, what you just described is you finding a way to add value, right?
Yeah.
So you might have what you're passionate about, but you've got to offer some value in whatever it is you're doing. And, that's now your product that you get advertisements on or whatever that might be, however you monetize the podcast. But, it started because you had to provide value on that end of things. To go back to your
sense. Yeah, I like that though. Yeah.
Yeah. To go back to your question kind of about the pushback, I was going to give you an example that, we've seen quite a bit of, there definitely will be people that say, oh, I'm not willing to pay for time. And it almost becomes a way to weed out and to find who's serious that a lot of people really love.
Yeah.
So for example, I'm really connected with a lot of social media influencers, kind of the businesses I've been in, I've been with a lot of them. And if you go to someone who's a legit influencer and you go look in like their Instagram message requests, not their inbox, but the ones that don't follow them, thousands of messages. Like I've seen it over and over of all these people, and most of them are wannabes. They don't have an actual partnership that they can bring, but there are some in there that are legit brands that are trying to reach out, that influencer would want to know. And so, for example,
but they just get lost in the message request. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. So all of a sudden you respond to everyone and say, okay, sure, I'll do this, but I charge $50 for an hour. You might only have 10 of your 2,000 that do that, but the 10 that do it, they've researched you, they're serious. That probably has the best chance of being the best meeting too. So I think there can be some benefit of people self-selecting out.
Yeah. You know what? That's true, because I was just talking about this the other day when I was recording a podcast, right? But we were talking about this, and it's always come up, right? But like I used to do, I still do now a little bit, but I used to be a heavy into like sales training. And now I'll do it every once in a while, but I'm focused primarily on my podcast. But I remember not growing up, but like being new in the sales training world. So I had sold for like 6 years. I was really good at what I did. And now I'm training teams and people. And during my 6 years, I had paid probably like 15 or 20 grand into my own sales training, along with the experience, like my own sales training. And but I'm like, ADHD. So I kept everything because I knew I would forget. So I have like a whole Google Drive folder with like Grant Cardone, Jim Rohn, Jeb Blunt, all these guys, all the big Anthony Marino, all these guys. And when I would train people, I'd be like, hey, if you want to learn, here you go. Like it's all free.
Yeah.
And if I had 10 people, 0 people would take me seriously. And then when I started sales training, I made my own program. I put in all my own stuff and started charging for it. And 10 out of 10 would join. It's just it's just the weight that we put in that money, that we have to stick with it almost.
For sure. I love that story. And I've heard so many similar to that, because that's perceived value, right? Yeah. Like, if I'm a golfer and my dad's a golf pro, and it's like the guys that teach the most lessons are the ones that charge the most.
Yeah.
Because it makes people think, well, if I'm going to take a golf lesson, I want the best guy. And if he's 100 and he's 75, I'm going with the 100 guy.
Yeah.
And so I really think there's value in being confident in what value you add, putting an actual price to that, and then sticking with it. And, valuing your time and the time of others, that you're serious and that what you're bringing to the table, is a big deal.
Yeah. I'm a religious buff, right? So there's that saying in the Bible that's like, don't cast your pearls before swine.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Right? Like, I have never heard anyone say religious buff. I like that. I say history buff, but you're a religion buff. Let's go.
Yeah. Well, that was funny. So you want to hear a funny story just about this whole, because it just kind of flows with our topic, right? Like when I was growing up, I was in I grew up in a really small town. And I remember telling my mom one day, she's like, what do you want to do when you grow up? We have that conversation. And I was like, well, you know what? I really like teaching. Like, I really like coaching people and teaching people. And my mom goes, she's like, well, teachers don't make any money, so you got to pick something different. And I was like, ouch. But because of that small town, we didn't have a lot of exposure to like ideas or anything. Like in my town, it was like you were one of the, you're the only CPA or attorney or whatever, right? Or you worked in the factory, or you worked on the farm. Like that's just what you did, right? And so there wasn't a whole lot of exposure around those ideas. But now 2022, right? We're like coaches and consultants, and like being a teacher means more than just teaching in a classroom. And so it's just funny. Like then I found my way through like, oh, okay, I can teach, and like, oh, I can actually I can have a lot of fun and still do what I love, because I do love religion and philosophy, right? And you can do all those things because we're in this passion economy. We're in this like connected economy now. So it's so true. I wish I would have done this earlier, but I'm doing it now. So
I love that visual of you talking about the small town you grew up in, and because you can almost feel it like being in a different time that we struggle relating with now. And to me, it goes to show like this evolution of values that's taken place, because 40 years ago, or in a small town like that, like what you valued most was stability, was security. It was the fact that you were going to put food on the table, and you had generations that doing that was the American dream, right? Like having that cookie cutter house in an American suburb with a white picket fence was like, we've made it. I think as society evolves and expands, all of a sudden now, like the things we value aren't necessarily safety or security. It's doing what we love. It's fulfillment. It's travel. It's flexibility. It's not being bored doing the same monotonous thing your whole life, right? And so to me, I think like that always is the higher level, and then the trickle down of how people then actually go about applying that.
Yeah. Well, and it's just like we even get in like small town mindsets, right? Too. Like I meet people with that. I'm like, like for example, it's just so in my when I grew up, it's just so crazy. And this is why I kind of want to like go back to my hometown and like offer some of these things to kids, because like you just don't know what you don't know. Like for example, I tell the story all the time. People are probably sick of hearing it, but it was a very pivotal moment in my life where, in high school, you do the how-to award, or like the most likely to succeed award, or whatever, the most likely to award. So growing up, I was always salesman. I was selling, like I got kicked out of the school playground because they were selling like Fruit Loops and stuff. And I was like, dude, I can sell it for cheaper. I can buy it for cheaper, sell it for cheaper, and make money. So I'd peddle these things on the playground. Kick me out. They're like, you can't do that. So I have stories like that, right? So like what happens when I get to high school when they have these most likely to awards? Well, the one that I win is most likely to be a con artist award, because in a small town, you don't know what a salesman is.
Yeah, that is too funny.
You know what I mean? It's like, you just get into these mindsets and like people, so I love this idea. And I guess to kind of bring it full circle, I love this idea that, teaching people how to make money doing what you're passionate about, and that's actually possible. Because like, if you're in a small town, if you're in a high school where there's only 500 kids in the middle of Iowa, that isn't really possible if you don't know those things.
Yeah.
There you go.
I love that. We have some of those same genetics of trying to move some product on the recess playground.
Yeah.
I love it.
I sold, like when I growing up, I sold like candy like that. And then one time my mom, so I lived in a town in Iowa right next to Nauvoo, Illinois. And it's a big history site for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So back then there was a big pageant, and it would bring like hundreds of thousands of people, like literally into the town. And so one day my mom comes home with like the trunk is full of like these store pulled ties. So like if it's kind of like a Nordstrom's rack model. Like if Macy's doesn't sell all their ties, they'll give them to Nordstrom's rack, and Nordstrom's rack will sell them at a discount. So she comes back with all these ties, and she's like, hey, you're going to earn some money this summer. She got me a chair and a tent, laid out all the ties. And for like 2 summers, I spent all my time out there selling like these store-bought ties, like a lemonade stand, but like not a lemonade stand.
That's awesome. I mean, there's so much in that story of hustle and grit and figuring it out. But I think, at the heart of every salesperson is the ability to communicate, and the ability to communicate value, to be able to ask questions to find what they need, what they're looking for, why should they care in the first place. And so, it's funny that society salespeople are really good at it, almost seem too smooth than the con artist, right?
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's good, effective communicators that know how to say what they have and help other people find that need, or maybe find a need that I didn't know I needed a tie, but that's exactly what I need.
Yeah. You're like, dude, that's it. Right. Well, and it's just this idea that like, I mean, when you're talking about, to kind of bring it full circle with your company opt and everything like that, right? It's just like, do you you know what I mean? Like giving the right amount of time to the right people, and sometimes, it's got to hurt a little bit to do that.
Yeah.
Like that's what, it's just what we got to do. And so I just think it's funny that when we talk about all of this, like, I mean, putting skin in the game to talk to somebody that you really want to talk to, that's it, right? That's what it's all about.
Yeah. And there's definitely, there's the expert guru side of things that'll be used a lot, but then there's some use cases that we've been surprised by. Like one industry that's just loved this has been construction. And so, for example, you've got a lot of contractors now that are charging for bids. And, because if you're going to go out to someone's house, travel there, go check it out, give a bid, it's probably a couple hours for most of these contractors. I was just talking to one of our users that basically said, I'm a general contractor. I have 8 houses that I'll build at a time, but I will do 5 to 10 bids a week. And so like he knows how big that number is. And he goes, and so that's 20 hours a week I'm spending. And most of those people just want to pick my brain. They just want to get a quote. Dude. They just want to get numbers.
They kind of like manipulate you a little bit, like come do a bit on my house. And, how would you do that again? And then they just go do it themselves.
For sure.
Yeah.
And so he's like, I don't have a way to charge for that. So all of a sudden, if they can schedule, the money's paid, they go and do that. All of a sudden you have all these people that have struggled making money before a contract is signed.
Yeah. That's funny that the GCs wouldn't do that. Cause like, HVAC or electrician or any of those guys will make you pay. They're like, it's like 150 for me to just come out there and talk to you. Right.
Sure.
Yeah, but that's funny that GC, but it's a great use case because it's so true. But and you know what it reminded me of is like, so your general contractor in that story has 8 houses that they're building, but they spend 20 hours on the side doing bids and all these things. And that just makes me think of like how to monetize, your side income, because like everybody does that, right? Like I work 40 hours a week, but I do all this stuff on the side that I'm sure, if you're in a position like that where you're with someone's time, right, you could definitely do that. It's just another way to like make money on your side hustles. That's a great idea.
Yeah, I think you said that so well. And that goes back to what we said earlier, like you don't have to be just one thing. You can have a side hustle and you can find other ways to monetize.
Now this is something that I struggled with. I just only recently kind of got over it. But like, how do you tell people, like when you have throw this idea at people, pitch this idea to people of like this building your personal network, and it's okay to like, have your 9 to 5, but also be working on this side stuff. Cause I was always afraid that if like my employer knew that I was doing a podcast or something like that they would get upset. Right. And actually what I found out was the exact opposite, but I felt like, I could have done this way earlier. So I don't know, does that conversation ever come up to like, I could do it, but like my boss will say this, or like, what will happen to my network or something like that. Right.
Oh, I have this conversation all the time. And I think this is the evolution that's happening in the workforce as well, that was shown to us by COVID. So like what you just explained is employers have always been used to feeling like they owned a person, right? Like I own everything in your professional space, and the amount of time you put in, like you have one way to make money, and that's the salary I pay you. And so all of a sudden people started working from home, and you had these corporations that felt like they'd lost control. They're like,
Yes.
well, how do we know if people are putting in an 8-hour day? What if they're working on other things? Like, it was all fear
Yeah.
driven. And to me, I think the shift that's starting to take place, and obviously we still have a long ways to go,
Right.
is by changing the way you actually value employees. So it becomes less about the number of hours they're there doing their job, which,
Yeah.
by the way, we know a lot of people, will be at the office for 8 hours, but maybe only do stuff a couple of those hours.
Well, sure. Yeah. I
And
mean, it's, yeah.
and then figuring out, so how do you now reward people based on output and reward them in a way that's based on what they're actually doing? And if a company can do that well, then who cares what else they have going on, right? It only brings energy. Like, do it, come to work. Don't feel like this is the only monotonous thing you have to do. But it does require a paradigm shift in the business to not just say, oh, I'm paying you for your time. Like, I'm paying you to do X, Y, and Z, which should take this amount of time to do it well.
And you're right. It is kind of changing, because you have this whole idea that's like, now it is more output driven. So, but like sales has always been like that. I'm sure you're familiar, right? Like, like when the pandemic shut down, like no one cared. Like, they were like, have your cameras on so we know you're alive or whatever, right? But for the most part, it was like, you have quotas that you have to hit, and if you don't hit them, there, then we'll have a talk. But otherwise, if you're, like, sales is one of those where you have like the Top Gun position, where it's like, if you're doing what you're doing, sweet, we'll leave you alone. But if you're not, that's when we need to have a talk. And so, how do you incorporate that into some other positions that aren't necessarily measured on that kind of an output, right? But I agree, though, because it's just so like, but like doubling down on my personal network and doubling down on like, like valuing me and who I really am outside of like my work changed my whole life. It saved me from a layoff that could have been really catastrophic. That's catastrophic for a lot of people, but I was really blessed to like 2 months before that start really doubling down. I was like, you know what, I don't care anymore. I'm just going to do this, and whatever happens. And it ended up being great. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I'm glad you pointed that out. It was kind of dawning on me as you said that the reason that people are attracted to sales is because of the flexibility, because of the freedom, and that, like, they're betting on themselves at the end of the day, a salesperson, right? Like, you can make this much money or this much money, and it depends on how things turn out.
Right.
And could you pay an accountant like a salesperson? Could you pay your customer support rep like a salesperson? And it's going to depend, but like, I think that organizations can figure it out.
I think we're already kind of doing that. Like, what 2020 also brought up was like the outsourcing economy too, if you want to call it that, right?
Yeah.
Like, where you have like this idea that, you're just like, we can outsource everything. And so like, for me, like a virtual assistant who, like a bookkeeper, right?
Yep.
Like, bookkeepers get paid by the hour, but you pay them up front. Like, I will give you 10 hours worth of work. This is what you can expect. And once I'm done, I'm done.
Yeah.
So it's a good point to bring that up. Like, you could start paying people like that pretty easily, because we have deadlines. We have to, but the hard part that you're going to run into, I feel like, Connor, is people just not wanting to give up that power. Like you mentioned.
Sure.
They feel like they have that control, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm by no means thinking that we're going to change everyone's mind in the world, right? Like, there will always be organizations that are like, we own you, you're going to do this. But I think there's already an existing need for this in such a major way, and I only think that'll increase. And I mean, just like any business, right? There's going to be downsides to all of it, and some people are going to think your product's stupid and never use it, and that's okay. Move on to the next.
Yeah. I love it, dude. I love that, man. No, ops going to the moon for sure, bro. Well, hey, we're running up on time, but you've been more than generous with your knowledge and your time. So, but tell everybody how they can follow you, where they can, if they want to join ops, if they want to start looking into it. How does that work? Is it live yet, or are you still working on everything?
Perfect. So yeah, go to optme.com, optme.com. And we are about 2 weeks away from our launch. And what we're doing right now is we're actually gathering a group. We're calling it our early adopters, pun intended, that are actually getting credits and getting early access to the product before we do like our full scale public launch. So anyone that's listening, feel free to go check that out. Go join. Feel free to invite some other people to be some of those first to get their hands on it as well. And it's going to be a fun ride. I just finished with the development team before this call, and it is like, oh, it's so cool to see an idea become a thing, you know, to go to that point. It's not easy to do. And I'm really excited to see where that goes. And as far as following me, it's just Connor Dehlin is my handle on all social channels, and you can find my podcast and things like that there as well.
Oh, dope. I love it, man. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for being here, and I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks, Dalton, for having me on, and love what you're doing and what you're trying to make happen.
Thank you, sir.